The sys module gives us a very basic mechanism to pass command line arguments to our program as a list of strings. But if we want to do any kind of validation or error checking on these arguments, the argparse module is by far the better choice. The argparse module is also part of the Python standard library. The argparse module makes it really easy to parse and validate the command line arguments. It allows us to specify default values for these arguments. It automatically generates help and usage messages and issues error messages where needed. Let's go to PyCharm to demonstrate argparse. The module demo args is available on Canvas. Please download it to follow along. Let's open a terminal window and run the program. We type python demoargs.py and here's what we get. It looks like we're getting an error. Let's get some help on the program. We can do that by specifying the -h option. And here's the help. So we're given the usage of the program, how we can invoke it. It takes an optional h argument for help. It takes an optional v argument for verbose. And then it has these 4 positional arguments, blue, yellow, green, and this is supposed to be the background color, players, how many players, scale, what scale to use, and a score file to be used to save the score. So now that we know that we need to specify a color, let's try red. And we get an error message. It's an invalid choice. We need to choose from blue, yellow, or green. Let's close the terminal window and look at our program. So we're using argparse here. And let's look at the getArguments function. So the first thing we're doing is we are instantiating an argument parser object. The class argument parser is defined in the argparse module. After instantiating the argument parser object, we can invoke add argument on that parser object to add each argument we're going to use. So the first argument we're adding here is the color. This is the help message that goes with the color. And these are the valid choices for our colors. So this tells argparser only the strings blue, yellow, and green are valid here. Anything else, like red, will result in an error. Let's move on to the second argument, players. This is supposed to be the number of players. The type of this argument is integer. If we specify anything but an integer, we get an error. This argument is optional. That's why we specified the question mark for n-args, number of arguments. The question mark stands for 0 or 1. And the default value for this argument is 2, which means if the user decides not to specify that argument, the program will use the default value 2. Let's go back to the terminal and invoke the program and specify yellow as our color here. The only output we have is this hello here. So let's try to invoke the program again with the verbose option to see if we can get more details about the default arguments values. So the output we get tells us that we are starting a yellow game with 2 players. That's the default value of the number of players. at a scale of 10. So if we take a look at our main function, we can see where this output is coming from. It's only printed if the verbose variable is true. And that verbose variable is actually an optional argument that we specify. Its value is set in the getArguments function. So v dash v and dash dash verbose are arguments that were added to our parser object. Any argument that starts with a dash or two dashes is an optional argument. We call it an option as opposed to a positional argument. Typically, options have two names, a short name, like dash v, and a longer name, two dashes, verbose. And the action here is important. In this case, our action is store true. That means if the v option is specified, the value of the corresponding argument will be true. We have two more arguments to look at, the score file and the scale. Let's start with the scale. So this argument is a positional argument. It has a default value of 10. And then its type is actually a function name. Scale type is a function that we defined earlier. What happens when we define a function as our type? The return value from that function is used as the value of our argument. So let's see what the scale type function is doing. So this function takes the user entered scale and validates it. It makes sure it's a number, and it checks that it's less than 10. If these two conditions are not met, the function raises an argument type error with a corresponding error message. So let's say the user entered hello. We cannot convert hello to a float. Python raises a value error. This function catches the value error and then raises an argparse argument type error to tell argparse that the user entered an invalid number. Now, if the user entered a valid number, but let's say it's less than 10, so let's say the user entered 3.5, then the scale is less than 10, and this function raises an argument type error with a message must be greater or equal to 10. Now, if these two error conditions are not there, let's say the user entered 25.3, then the function converts that 25.3 to an integer. We get 25. It divides it by 10 as integer division. So we get a 2 here, then multiply that 2 by 10. So the function will return a 20 in that case. So the argument value that is assigned to the scale argument will be 20 in this case and not 25.3. So let's go to the terminal window and try that out. We'll specify a yellow game for 5 players, and for the scale, let's just write scale. And we get this error, argument scale invalid number. We can do that in verbose mode as well, and we get the same problem. Now let's specify a number for the scale, but instead of a valid number, let's specify 3.5. 3.5 is invalid because it's less than 10. And let's do that in verbose mode. We get the error message must be greater or equal to 10. So we are in this part of the code here. The scale was less than 10. And finally, let's specify a valid argument. Let's specify 47.2 as our scale. You can see that the scale used in the game is actually 40, not 47.2, because the return value from the scale type function was used here. And the last argument we'll look at is the score file. So the user specifies a file name, but the validation function, file type, defined in the argparse module actually opens the file with the parameter specified, here with a mode of X and encoding of UTF-8, and it returns a file object. So the rest of our program has access to score file as a file object, and we can write to it. In this case, we're just writing hello. So let's see how that works in the terminal. So let's specify a file name. Let's say we're going to call it scores.txt, and we can look here to see if the file here, the file scores.txt was created in my folder here, and it only has hello. Now let's see what happens if I run the same program again with the same arguments. I get an error because scores.txt already exists, and because we're trying to open the file in mode X, it will not overwrite it. If I change that mode to W, then I should be okay. It doesn't complain, it overwrites the file. So it's convenient if I need to validate a file to use argparse, and I don't have to deal with the file name anymore. I get a file object back from my argument parser.